This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Jovanni, Shiloh, Monisha, and Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Jovanni, here with Monisha. Thank you for being with us today. How are you doing, Monisha?
I'm doing pretty good. Thank you for always leading the charge, Giovanni. I appreciate your labor.
Thank you. Likewise. Today we have an interesting talk, and it's going to be based around your neck of the wood. So let's talk about a place that defines the word colony, Puerto Rico. The oldest colony in the world, for 400 years under Spain, a brief occupation under the British, now over a century and a quarter under American rule. Its economy and politics are controlled from Washington, the Gibraltar of the Caribbean, America's primary base to project power into what it sees its own backyard and its own Mediterranean Sea. For generations, this has created a torn identity in the island or in the archipelago, a proud, distinct nationhood living alongside deep political confusion shaped by that long, coercive relationship with the United States. But in recent years, a clear shift has been underway. The generation that came of age under the fiscal board of austerities and Hurricane Maria is looking at this colonial reality with new clarity, and this awakening echoes through culture, street protests, to the global music charts, where artists give voice to a resurgent nationalism and a rejection of the island's subjugated status. We're seeing a new political consciousness, one that draws sharp internationalist solidarity, directly challenges Puerto Rico's role as a U.S. military asset. The confusion of the past is hardening into a clear-eyed resistance. So what is driving this new consciousness? What does it mean for the future of the island and century-long struggle against empire? That's our focus for today, and we have a guest from Puerto Rico to talk to us about that. Alexis Colon de Jesus is a Puerto Rican activist and socialist militant. He studied at the Graduate School of Economics at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. His area of study includes geopolitical economy and Marxist theory. His favorite quote from Marx is, "Ignorance never helped anyone." For him, having solidarity with and struggling for the wretched of the earth are the most important things we can do and must do. Alexis, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
Before I jump in, there's planes.
From the base, right?
I'm so close to it.
Oh, that's our reality here.
Is
That's
it loud
a
though?
little bit. We can definitely hear them.
Okay,
That's good. That way,
But
people see what those after right.
Yeah.
People can see
listen to
pretty much
that.
what we're talking about.
This is not made up. This is not AI. This is the reality we're living.
Yeah. I think that's the last one landing. We can continue.
All right, you want to start us off?
All right, Alexis, as Giovanni said, thank you for joining us today. It's really important. I think all of us that are speaking to our audience today are Puerto Rican. So this is a very personal and touching topic for each of us, just to encourage us all to be real about it, to be human about it. Starting off with how you got to where you are now with your political formation and who you see yourself to be in the midst of all of this. Could you share with us your political journey? Were you exposed to readings, people, scholars, theorists? How did you get to be who you are politically?
I grew up in a house where my family, they vote for the statehood party. I grew up in that environment, believing all of the propaganda about how bad we would have it if we became an independent nation and how we would be without the United States. My journey towards the idea of independence started in high school with the campaign of Edwin Irizarry ran for the Independence Party in 2008. That's what began opening my eyes. He always spoke about the need for independence so that we could join the rest of the world. Because as a colony, we don't have any sovereignty. We can't decide who we commerce with. We can't decide what goes on in our own country. I went to the University of Puerto Rico, first at Mayagüez, then I did my master's in Tras. I had a professor of sociology who was a Marxist, and that's how I first got exposed to Marxism. And it's been a long journey. Yesterday, Michael Parenti passed away, and he was a key figure in my political formation. He taught me the importance of actually existing socialism. That's why I consider him so important, because he opened the eyes of a lot of people of the reality of empire, of the reality of actually existing socialism, and how this acts as a sort of straitjacket on the productive forces of this economy. No wonder that Cuba, for example, faces poverty when they are facing a genocidal embargo by the most powerful nation on earth. From then on, I got interested in Marxist theory and the fundamentals of it, political economy and philosophy. I think Marxism is important because it's scientific socialism. It's a scientific discipline, which is important to remember. It's not philosophy, it's not religion, and its method, dialectical and historical materialism, the tool that we use to understand our social reality. The first step to change our social reality is to understand it. You can't change it if you don't understand it. Marxism is definitely the best tool to understand our social reality, to understand power. I actually made a conscious decision that I wanted to understand how the world works, and that eventually led me to study Marxism. I eventually came to the conclusion that it's the best tool for that.
And so, along your path towards meeting Marx and learning how to analyze the world around you through his lens, how did that shape you as an independentista? Like, was there a specific moment for you when you were like, I'm an independentista? And did that come before your introduction to Marx, after your introduction to Marx? Where did that fit into your journey?
Definitely before. I think it's easier to become independentista than Marxist. There's more propaganda to overcome to reach Marx and to understand actually existing socialism. So yeah, I started the shift towards it in high school. And then it wasn't until I got into the University of Puerto Rico that I became a socialist. I got interested in anarchism. I read Godwin, who is credited as being the first anarchist. JP. I never got to him because I read some anti-Semitic quote by him, and that should have told me everything I needed to know about anarchism. Come to find out after reading Proudhon that he also was an anti-Semitic. Anarchy sort of started the conspiracy that Marxism, was a Jewish conspiracy. So the Nazis kind of borrowed from them. So yeah, then I don't know, for Michael Parenti and other people. Michael Hudson has also been a huge influence on me. Richard Wolff as well. Got my political formation mostly from the internet. That's why I think projects like what you're doing here is so important, because this helps to foster consciousness and class consciousness.
Alexis, can you speak closer to the computer?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to speak louder then.
Yeah,
Because I'm
okay.
wearing headphones with a integrated mic. I apologize.
Thank you.
Move on.
Yeah. It's interesting about what you mentioned about independentista, how it's easier to become independentista than to have uh, a materialist understanding of the world. And I say that because there's different flavors of independentistas that pretty much echo everything that comes from the empire, you know. And there's different flavors. There are independentistas that truly believe in the capitalist market.
You have right-wing independentistas.
So there's different
It's not
flavors.
necessarily left or right-wing.
And there are also the independentistas that want like a Palau, like the territory of Palau, the option of being independent, quote unquote, but at the same time being tied to the United States. So there's
Yes.
different flavors.
It's a spectrum.
Yeah, last class dysphoria, and the whole thing about the notion of citizenship and access to the United States anytime. Also, it's a powerful tool of subordination as well. I left Puerto Rico. I'm much older than both of you, I guess. And I left Puerto Rico in my teens. The reality when I was living in Puerto Rico is different than what I'm seeing now with young people. I was in the 8th grade when I left. I left Puerto Rico in the beginning of the 90s. Senior generation has a shift compared to what I remember how it was Puerto Rico. Like, for example, I'm gonna give you an example. I was seeing this guy on social media saying that, he was in America, he was Black American. He was saying, I wish someone loved me. Puerto Ricans love their flag. He was talking about how they put flags
And
everywhere.
there's a good reason for that.
But what I'm trying to get here is that when I was coming up, there was a saying is that Puerto Ricans become Puerto Ricans when they come to the United States. Because in Puerto Rico at the time, they didn't brandish the Puerto Rican flag like you see now. If anything, people who brandished the Puerto Rican flag in Puerto Rico, right, they were called independentistas, and that was used as a slur. It was used as being called independentista at the time. It was used as a slur, it was a frown upon at the time when I left Puerto Rico. But now you see flags everywhere. Can you go over some of the dynamics of why that shift, and a flag is something that seems so mundane, so innocent, right? But it has a powerful connotation to it. Can you talk about that shift?
Yeah, being independentista was criminalized here, The flag was made illegal about the time of the gag law. I think it was instituted in 1948, if I'm not mistaken. So it was literally illegal to display the Puerto Rican flag and to fly the flag. You could go to jail. You will be branded an independentista and you will be persecuted. We have the famous carpetas binders. Those were files that the police and the FBI compile on independentistas and also communists as well. Literally, there were 1,000 files created on individuals. So yeah, it's part of the legacy of resistance here. That's why the flag is such a powerful and meaningful symbol, and that's why we fly it everywhere. And like you said, Puerto Ricans become Puerto Ricans when they move to the States. There's a saying here, you don't know what you have until you lose it. When you go and experience a different culture. Puerto Ricans are a warm people in the States, especially in big cities like New York, where I lived. People are a bit colder. People don't look you in the eye. People don't say good morning. There's not even a phrase for buen provecho in the English language. They borrow from the French language. You experience those cultural differences, and they definitely make you miss the warmth that you experience here. You also spoke about independentismo in a spectrum. There are right-wing independentistas, left-wing ones. The independentismo, the more modern brand started with bourgeois people, more landowners in the 19th century. Those were the people that had access to education and they read some thought and they were mostly radical liberals. They were definitely not socialists. People like Ramon Emeterio Betán, later Hostos. He was nationalist. He wasn't a socialist. There's a quote I read by him on why he didn't think Marxism applied to Puerto Rico because he thought, people were mostly campesinos here. We didn't have an industrial proletariat. But this is the first thing that Lenin covers. If you read the very first volume of the collected works of Lenin, he does a class analysis of Russian society. He concludes that there is a class differentiation in the rural areas where the campesinos are becoming agricultural proletarians. The majority of them, and a small minority, are becoming landowners. So there's this class differentiation, and that's why Lenin thought that this was a potentially revolutionary class. He was proven correct by the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. Vietnam, North Korea as well. These were mostly peasant societies, semi-feudal societies. And so the peasant class demonstrated that it is indeed a revolutionary class. What makes it revolutionary is the fact that it's that class differentiation. Capitalism was penetrating the whole world and peasants were becoming agricultural workers, proletarians. So Albizu kind of missed that as much as I admire him. And if you can see, I have a poster of Albizu behind me. So he's a key figure that everyone admires here, whether you're independent or communist because of what he did to sort of foster consciousness here and to fight for our freedom, our independence. And the fact that he was a revolutionary. We have a lot of reformist brands of independentismo, but Albizu was definitely a revolutionary and he understood the importance of armed struggle against a powerful empire that is extremely violent. Revolution is self-defense at the class level. If someone breaks into your house, you have every right to defend yourself if necessary, if you're being attacked. The same thing happens at the class level.
Yeah, I'll add to context about they call him maestro in Puerto Rico because he taught us how to be Puerto Rican again. And I say again because previous figures that taught us how to become Puerto Ricans was, you mentioned earlier Ramon Betances and people like Maria de Hosto in the 19th century. And that was kind of lost. And Albizu taught us how to be Puerto Rican again. But just to his credit, he was really influenced by the Irish independence movement of the 1910s and 20s. His majority of political activity was in 40s before the Chinese Revolution. And yeah, so that's a lot of, so it's a lot of his favorite word here, nuance.
He was a product of his time for sure. Antonio Correger, who was a bit younger than Albizu and also was a militant of the Nationalist Party, he actually became a socialist. And members of the Nationalist Party were too harsh against Antonio Correger because he was a communist, a Marxist. And so there was this sort of, I guess, struggle inside the movement whether we should go on a socialist direction But you had a lot of nationalists that were small owners, professionals, intellectuals, a more privileged class. There's been a bit of resistance in that way. Like I said, it's easier to become independentista and develop that consciousness than class consciousness. There's definitely been an increase in independentista sentiment here. I think there's been an increase in class consciousness as well, but it's lagging a bit behind. What you said about Albizu and the Irish struggle, I have the three tomes of Albizu's collected works. I've already read two. When Albizu was at Harvard, the Irish struggle for independence was unfolding. He gave a speech at Harvard University, and somewhere there, I don't remember who it was, said that it was the most powerful speech regarding the cause of the Irish people. So there are close ties between the Irish movement for independence and the Puerto Rican movement for independence. There's a lot of solidarity.
I'm thinking it might be good for us to help our audience members who may not have heard about independentismo before in the Puerto Rican context. Can we explain briefly what is independentismo in the Puerto Rican context so that they can understand better what we're discussing better? I'm sorry. Henry, can you delete what I just said? So, for our audience members who are new to hearing about Puerto Rico, things politically that are happening here, political ideas about Puerto Rico's status in relationship to the United States, could you, Alexis, explain what is independentismo?
Independentismo is the fight for our sovereignty, for national freedom, so that we can become part of the world instead of being an isolated colony of the US. Puerto Rico is the oldest continuous colony in the world. We've been a formal colony for over 500 years, going back to the Spanish Empire. Columbus arrived here in 1493. Ever since we've been occupied, they exterminated the native people here. They still live through our DNA. It's been proven through mitochondrial DNA. Mostly with the DNA that was passed was that of Taino women. The Spanish men usually came by themselves, killed the native Taino men or enslaved them, and great Taino women. So that's why we are sort of a product of that brutal and violent history, and we carry that. There's always been a struggle for freedom here, going back to the Spanish occupation in the 16th century, around 1510. The struggle by the Taino caciques against the Spanish, they fought bravely. We have, the stories of another and many other caciques that stood against the empire. Some collaborated. It's been a tried strategy of empires going back at least to the Romans, divide and conquer. So the Spanish were really good at that. They did that throughout the Americas. They pitted the indigenous groups against the Aztecs, for instance. And that's how they managed to subdue the native people here with a smaller force. Independence is that struggle for freedom that goes back for literally 5 centuries in Puerto Rico. And there were rebellions throughout the whole period. The slaves were imported here from Africa. The escaped slaves usually went on to live with the Tainos. There was a lot of solidarity between the African slaves and the Tainos who were also enslaved. And they had to retreat to the mountains just to be able to stay away from the violence of the colonizers. They also struggled for freedom alongside the Tainos. Later on, even poor white people joining the struggle. By the 19th century, we had the famous 1868, the 23rd of September of 1868. And that was an armed uprising led by and others. They took up arms and declared independence. And we had a republic for a few hours before the uprising was crushed. It was a watershed moment. From then on, the Spanish Empire had to give concessions, reforms. They used reforms to sort of unrest. Reform, you have to the people have to organize and fight for their rights and get these concessions. They're never given. They're earned. They gave concessions like you go to the Spanish courts and you were given full Spanish citizenship, and there was a greater autonomy granted to the archipelago. But that all ended in 1898 when the US Empire invaded during the Spanish American War. We were part of the colonial loot they took from the Spanish Empire. Cuba became a neo colony back then as well. And ever since then, there's been a struggle against the US empire. They were not welcome here. They were not received with open arms. People actually opposed US citizenship here being implemented. There was a referendum, and US citizenship was rejected by the people because, the people understand what's in their best interest, and they knew they would be used ever since. So in the US, citizenship was rejected, but they still, a couple of years later, forced it upon us so that they could use it as cannon fodder for the First World War. Thousands of Puerto Ricans were enlisted against their will to military draft. And that continued the enlistment against the people's will until the Vietnam War, when the draft sort of, I don't want to say it was abolished, but they could reinstate a draft anytime, but they had to, let go of it because of the growing resistance and the growing anti-war movement in the U.S. during the Vietnam era. And that's how my dad ended up being a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. He was drafted at the tender age of 17. He had just finished high school. He didn't want to go to war. He failed the exam on purpose. They were taking pretty much everybody back then. And so he was kidnapped, I like to say, from his home, forced to join the army at 17. It's basically enslavement. There's a definition of slavery that some generals created. It's forced labor against your will, whether it's remunerated or not. They were so aware that the draft perfectly fit this description that they made an exception to the rule, except in the case of a draft. So it's pretty much enslavement. And it's kind of like what the Romans would do. They would conquer a people, they would steal their land, and they would enslave the people and force them to become soldiers in their armies to further subjugate more people. And that's sort of what the US does to this day still.
Alexis, thank you for the description about independentismo to give the audience the spectrum of how our political society works. Can you give a brief description of Cesar Barbosa and what movement he led and the middle path that Marin put us in, and that pretty much ever since we've been in that triangle?
Monisha, you're a psychologist, right? He experienced racism in the United States, and somehow he still developed this prostate ideology. He's sort of credited as the first person to develop that ideology here in Puerto Rico. Statehood means wanting to integrate into the United States as a full-fledged state. And that movement grew considerably in the 20th century in Puerto Rico. The New Progressive Party was founded by him. It was Luis Ferrer, who was a Puerto Rican oligarch from a very wealthy family. He had a monopoly over cement production here. And yeah, they sold us the idea of statehood, the United States is democratic haven. And, there's a material component to it. Around the time of the Gag Law, after the ELA was instituted, the Asociado, which is a Commonwealth status that it's still in Puerto Rico, a lot of capital from the US entered the island doing what was called Operation Bootstraps. And this is why Marxism is so important. There's a concept of the falling rate of profit. Once capital accumulates and the composition of capital changes, and it becomes a capital of what Marx called a higher composition. This causes the rate of surplus value that capitalists are able to extract from the working class to drop. The mass of surplus value increases, but the rate of surplus value extraction decreases. So this is an impetus for capitals in the imperialist countries to seek other markets to exploit foreign labor, where they can extract a high rate of profit. Puerto Rico was perfect for that. The US had industrialized, the rate of profit was falling. Puerto Rico being a colony, it goes the reverse process of capital accumulation. There's capital extraction, and we know that the primitive accumulation of the imperialist countries has its genesis in colonization, in the extraction of value from the colonies. The reverse process happened here. That meant that there was a huge rate of profit to be extracted from the island by US capitalists. Ever since 1898, when they moved, they started exploiting Puerto Rican landowners through different means. They turned the whole basically into a sugarcane plantation because it was the most profitable crop. This is a classic example of a cash crop. It doesn't have any nutritional value. It's all exchange value that it has. And landowners were displaced, and for the Puerto Rican people worked the sugarcane fields for U.S. corporations. But then there was a period of industrialization around the 50s and 60s, or what we call pseudo-industrialization. With Operation Bootstraps, we moved away from the plantation economy into a more industrial economy. But I say it was a pseudo-industrialization because it was foreign capital that was carrying out the process, and the profits were repatriated to the United States. So they were not reinvested here, and the people didn't benefit much. But that brought a process of accumulation, provided jobs, increased wages, and it was seen as progress. But eventually, the capitals left the archipelago. As the archipelago became more industrialized, their profit began to fall. And then we reached the neoliberal era where capital was free to move wherever it wanted to exploit cheaper labor and extract higher profits. You start to see industries leave the archipelago because our industries, we didn't have any sovereignty over them, any capital controls. So that halfway process of industrialization came to a halt. And ever since then,
What year was that?
what year was the beginning, the ending of the industrialization
Where you're at
process?
right now, like what you're talking about right now, where the industries began to leave. Around what time frame?
I would say it was during the rise or after the rise of the neoliberal era in the 80s. The neoliberal era begins in Chile after the there against the Salvador government. Under the Pinochet dictatorship, they turned Chile into a laboratory for you had Milton and the Chicago school down there working hand in glove with Pinochet and U.S. capital. And after that, the neoliberal model was exported to the rest of the world. So I would say probably began around the 80s. By the 70s, you had a crisis with the oil crisis of the 70s, and there was stagnation. So there was an impetus for capital to leave the US and by extension Puerto Rico to seek higher profits in other markets. So around the 80s, in the 90s, you had the section, there it was called, these tax exemptions that were granted to foreign capital, mainly US capital, to attract it to the island, Operation Bootstraps. But that wasn't enticing anymore because now you could go to other markets where they would also give you tax exemptions, but labor was cheaper and you could extract more profits. So during that era of Operation Boots, when there was this halfway process of industrialization, the US government invested in infrastructure, education, but all of it was to satisfy the needs of capital. They needed roads, they needed trains to transport first the sugar cane, then highways to transport industrial products. They wanted to sell cars here as well, so that's another incentive. And now that capital has left, we're seeing the reverse process. We're seeing a process of financialization of the economy. What that means is that the economy is divided between goods and services. Goods is the industrial production. Services, it's whatever is not goods, essentially. So has value, it's the goods and services. And that's what creates value as well. So when the service sector grows at the expense of the industrial sector, that's a problem. The service sector includes what Michael Hudson calls the FIRE sector. It's an acronym for finance, insurance, and real estate. These sectors don't produce any value. There's no industrial production involved in these sectors. They appropriate value to rent because these sectors are natural monopolies. They always tend towards monopoly, and when you operate a monopoly, you can extract a rent, which is the difference between the higher monopoly price and what Marx called the price of production, which includes the average profit for capital. So they extract what is called super profits or rents. This is extremely inefficient for the economy because it reduces the disposable income of consumers, thereby decreasing the effective demand of the economy. And also it reduces the profits of the capitalist enterprises that are in sectors where there is competition. This diminishes the ability of capitalists to reinvest their profits as capital, which combined with the decline in the effective demand is disastrous because when the demand is reduced, the supply goes down as well. There's not incentive to invest capital. So there's no job creation. The financialization of the economy increases the cost of production. So it's not as profitable to produce, and this is an incentive for capitals to leave the island to seek places, markets where there are lower wages, but also where places like China, where the monopolies are nationalized and the cost of production is much more smaller. Vietnam nowadays as well, it's probably the cheapest country where you can produce because there's no rent extraction. This is a much more efficient model. It's the antithesis of neoliberalism, basically.
It's interesting. You mentioned the IRS code of 936. And when I left Puerto Rico, that was what they were talking about.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
yeah. 936 was an incentive that was given to American corporations to operate from Puerto Rico, and they didn't pay U.S. taxes from operating from Puerto Rico. And what Alexis is talking about here, this had the effect of producing high-paying jobs for a lot of people. Because I went to school.
yes,
I went to
yes.
school. I went from Guayama, from the south, and I went to a private school. There was a company nearby called the Phillips. I want to say they were a petrol company. I'm not sure what they were, but most of the people worked there. They were professional. It was more of a white collar thing. And also at the time, there were a lot of pharmaceutical companies operating off of Puerto Rico. It's like I think good chunk of the medicines that were sold here in the United States were produced in Puerto Rico during that time.
Still to this day, there's
Right.
a huge pharmaceutical industry here. Yeah.
But what 936 did was end that code and was phased out in '06, I believe, in 2006. And that had a huge impact to the economy in Puerto Rico. It lost around 40,000 employment, 40,000 people. When you lose those 40,000 high paying jobs, these people move to the United States. And there were other things to compound on that, which is the huge debt. And then that's when Promesa came, the oversight board that Obama imposed. And Hurricane Maria came and devastated the economy of Puerto Rico. More people left. I think the last 20 years, about 1 million people have left Puerto Rico to the United States. So they have a huge depletion of population. Fertility rate have dropped in Puerto Rico. And I bring all this up because when you come in age, you're seeing that economic devastation in Puerto Rico. When I was growing up in Puerto Rico, it was like the highlight, the high phase. You talked about independentismo in Puerto Rico at the time. People say, independentismo for what? Why you want us to be like Dominican Republic? That was a famous phase. You want us to be like Dominican Republic? Now they're saying, you want us to
Yeah.
be like Venezuela? You want us to be like Cuba? Depends for what? Why do we need independence? There was a lot of people saying that. But when all those factors started coming in with Hurricane Maria, Promesa and everything, and the collapse of the economy in Puerto Rico and people leaving, austerity and stuff like that, now there's kind of no economic growth in Puerto Rico right now. And you come into that age. So how does that shape you? How does that shape your generation into this new resurgence of consciousness among people in your age group?
My generation has only known decline. It's funny you mentioned the Dominican Republic. They no longer use that because the Republic is growing at 5-6% annually. And you're having Dominican immigrants returning to the Dominican Republic from Puerto Rico because it's growing pretty soon with the stagnation that we have here. They might surpass us in nominal GDP terms. So they no longer use that scare tactic. But like I said, my generation has only known decline. I'm a millennial born in 1992. There was a lot of corruption in the 90s with the Rosselló administration, a lot of wasted money in projects which haven't been completed to this day. There's this highway from my hometown to Ponce that began construction or was approved in the 90s, and still to this day it hasn't been finished, and it may never will. Like you said, the exemptions were abolished, capital left, there was industrial decline. You still see empty buildings of what were industrial factories back in the day. So with the industry, the jobs left as well. And a lot of people had to migrate. There's a double component that we must have present to understand why there was support for statehood and the opposition to independence. The sort of scapegoat is one, because there is migration from Puerto Rico to the United States. So there's a dearth of capital here, which will normally create overwhelming poverty. And there is a lot of poverty here. The poverty rate is almost 50%. But it would be much, much higher if people would migrate to the United States. That's one component because people don't want to lose that scapegoat. Many people want the ability to move to the United States in case things get too bad here. There's also the welfare state. The gains of the New Deal eventually were instituted here. A lot of these federal transfers are earned and we pay for them, like Social Security. You have to contribute to Social Security. It's not a gift. But there are some transfers, the famous components, sort of the equivalent of SNAP's benefits, that are needed to maintain that reserve army of labor so that the people don't rebel because of crushing poverty. And, these were reforms that the working class in the United States had to fight for. The 8 hour day was a struggle. People died for it. Then the New Deal, people credit Roosevelt as this sort of humanitarian. Roosevelt was much more conservative than people think. The New Deal, they had to do those concessions because at the time, you have to bear in mind the context, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the crushing poverty that the American people were experiencing. You had two socialist parties organized and one communist party organized, and they were growing quickly and conducting strikes. And the ruling class was very afraid that there would be a socialist revolution in the US. The memory revolution in Russia was still latent. And, people have these aspirations of a class liberation. And it was the pressure from the organized people that eventually forced the administration to institute the New Deal, which created Social Security, created a federal jobs program that gave employment to 50 million people, if I'm not mistaken. The minimum wage was first instituted under the New Deal. Those New Deal policies were instituted in Puerto Rico as well. The welfare state was created, and it sort of prevented material conditions from worsening, and they somewhat improved with the combination of the welfare state and the halfway industrialization that I talked about. So there's no surprise that during this time support for statehood increased because people were seeing some material gains, and we have to bear this in mind. A lot of the more right-wing independentistas speak in terms about the welfare state, about people who depend on the welfare state to no fault of their own. You have to understand what are people supposed to do. There are no jobs here, so you have to survive some way. And we can't chastise people for what they need to do to survive. We have to understand this and educate ourselves about it. But a lot of that is changing now. Like I said, my generation has only known decline. Capitals have left. The gains of the welfare state are being undermined. The cost of public education has skyrocketed. The lack of investment in infrastructure. We have collapsing infrastructure here, just like in the United States. But in the colony, everything is worse. Conditions are worse here than in metropolis. That's for me a major reason why support for independence is increasing and why support for statehood is decreasing. And there's a major generational divide. Like I said, my generation has only known decline, and so we are the age group that supports independence the most by far. And the older generations that grew up during the time of Operation Bootstraps and the rise of the welfare state, they still have memories of that. They still credit the US for that. Some of them, there's going mindset change even in older generations. But yeah, it's mainly younger people who support independence. It's mainly older generations that still support statehood or the so-called free association, the Commonwealth with this colonial status. And one more thing is that statehood is not the end of colonization. The statehood party borrowed the language of independence and even socialism. Decades ago, they had a march for the end of colonization. You think it was the Independence Party that organized this with that kind of language. But no, it was the statehood party because they want to make people believe that statehood would be the end of colonization. It's quite the opposite. It's the completion of the colonial project. That's what annexation implies. You fully lose your sovereignty. Take a look at Mississippi, take a look at Alabama and these poor states of the South where you have a higher percentage of Black people and immigrants. Still very poor states. The people still are exploited, and there's not a lot of sovereignty freedom or economic freedom. So these are the things that we must bear in mind to understand the complexities of the Puerto Rican struggle.
It's interesting too because the states in the US are also completed colonies. Like they are the
Yes.
completion of colonialism.
Yes.
Puerto Rico is a colonial project in the same way that the US is a colonial project.
You
Different
begin with
master
13
colonies.
colonies.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me as a psychologist who like my study is on the impacts of psychological warfare specifically from the US. So seeing how things are happening in real time in Puerto Rico historically as well, just the way that the mentality of colonialism and imperialism functions in individuals, in families, in communities, in the day-to-day life of people. If you don't have psychological warfare, you don't have colonialism succeeding. We hand ourselves over without our consent or awareness. It's really tragic. It's one of the great tragedies of colonialism. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of many other examples. Earlier on, when you mentioned about the person who started the PNP, or who
Luisa Ferré.
the way the patriarchy, white supremacy, capital, all of these things interplay to make people submit to domination because they need to feel powerful, because they feel so powerless under these systems of oppression. And as much as we can empathize with that and really understand and have compassion for it, the people that carry it on, their humanity is lost in the process, and there's no turning point for them to return to their true self, to be able to have empathy for others, to be able to say, no, I'm not going to replicate these systems of dominance and oppression and violence on others just because I can. I think that's probably a whole other show, a whole other episode or series of unpacking the psychology of colonialism and imperialism and capitalism. What makes an individual subscribe to that mentality? Even going back to earlier when we were talking about independentistas, we're not a monolith. We have people who want freedom only for themselves and for people who look like them or have the same economic situation, but they're perfectly happy to continue oppressing and exploiting others.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like that applies as well to our current situation where we are today with how the US has established itself here militarily and how now Puerto Rico is just a forward operating base. Let's turn to that conversation. We've been used to attack a sovereign state, our neighbor, our cousins. We continue to be used for real war exercises, for possible future invasions of other sovereign nations in our region or other family members in the region. And what I see on Puerto Rican social media is a scary amount of support for this. And at the same time, we see a lot of resistance to that. I also live here. For people who are listening, I've stayed muted a lot during this episode because I live directly across from the flight line of Roosevelt Roads, which has been reactivated, which has F-16s, all kinds of combat aircraft taking off at all hours. So it's very noisy. It's putting cracks in the ceiling. It vibrates the house. It disturbs the environment. It pollutes everything. We're having breathing problems here now. And this is our current reality. I'll stop talking now and switch over to you, Alexis. And Jovanni, if you want to add to a question or anything like that before Alexis starts, if there's any specific thing you want him to touch on.
Yeah, adding to what you were saying about the whole monolith and everything, and about what social media was, we're talking about the operation in Venezuela attacking a sovereign country, the kidnapping of its president, and currently being held for ransom. But there is, and it was funny because there are a lot of people in Puerto Rico that support it, and they're Puerto Rico oppose Puerto Ricans that oppose it. Guayama Arroyo, which is the city next to where I grew up, they used it as an amphibious landing exercise to rehearse an amphibious landing in Venezuela. So you have all these ships coming in the middle of the day, landing, all these soldiers just coming out of nowhere, from the ships. And, there were people there taking pictures, and there were people there, cameras and everything. There were people there selling food to the soldiers and stuff like that, you know. But yeah, and one of the things that was disturbing that I saw is that people who call themselves independentista or journalists, who are popular, putting the narrative out there, at the same time repeated the same narrative of Venezuela that was used to do this operation, about Maduro's regime, Maduro's dictatorship, and these people should know better. They should know better because they're pretty much echoing the same narratives, the same construct, that the imperial structure that they criticize, but they're repeating the same thing. Go ahead, Alexis.
A couple of quick points I'd like to make before jumping on the Venezuela discussion. Monisha, you were talking about some people want the freedom to exploit others, and that's what they mean by economic freedom. And when you touch on the psychological warfare, that's part of what's called the superstructure. There are two key figures we need to study to understand how hegemony and ideology reproduce themselves. There's a famous essay called State Apparatuses. The state apparatuses are, there's the violent arm that is the state, the violent repression, but there are also ways of manufacturing consent. The main ideological state apparatus that identifies under capitalism is education, the education system, and was the church. There's a famous that the priest and the landlord walk side by side holding hands, something along those lines. So we must understand that they control state apparatuses here in Puerto Rico. They control the Department of Education one way or another, and the universities receive federal funding. So they are able to shape what's taught and how. Beginning with the invasion, they forced English to be taught at schools. The people fought against it. So the Premio Príncipe de Asturias was granted to the Puerto Rican people as a whole for their defense of the Spanish language, which is kind of the closest thing to a literature prize. But it was stripped from us thanks to the Rosselló administration when they made English a second language. So yeah, through control of the education system, the media is very important. We have three mainstream news channels here. All three of them are owned by media oligarchs. Most famously Telemundo, owned by NBC, which is owned by Brian L. Roberts with a fortune of over $1.5 billion. And so they're able to control the narrative and feed propaganda to the people. And older generations that may not be tech savvy, all they have is the mainstream media. And the newspapers are controlled by the Ferrer family. So I told you about the founder of the PNP party. He also was the founder of the most widely circulated newspaper in Puerto Rico to this day. That family still owns that newspaper. They publish opinion columns about how awful socialism is and stuff like that. So that's how they are able to reproduce colonial in Puerto Rico.
Also, you have the Alexis. You have the churches that also help.
Oh yeah, very
that.
important component.
And you also have
Protestant churches.
you also have the weaponized immigrants like the Cubans, the Venezuelans that moved there as well.
Yep, yep, yep.
To help with that narrative.
Absolutely, the Gusanos are always complaining about how Fidel took their lands and their slaves away. That's why communism is so bad. So I'm sorry, what was it that you said before? The influence of Cuban and Venezuelans just right now?
You were saying how narratives are shaped in Puerto Rico, and you hear those components about the education and.
I remember now you brought the subject of the churches. There was a penetration by U.S. churches, Protestant churches. Nowadays, the evangelical movement is growing, and we know how reactionary that branch of Christianity can be. We're seeing the massive support they've given to Trump and his policies. That's also a big factor. The religion may not be the principal ideological state apparatus, but it's still a huge component to this day. Probably after the education system and the media, you have the church or religion as an ideological state apparatus of control. So yeah, that's also an important component. On the subject of Venezuela, people are using the term remilitarization of the archipelago. And I think that's the wrong term to use because it implies that at some point we were demilitarized. We've always been military occupied since the invasion of 1898. There's definitely been an increase in militarization, but it never stopped. The Marines occupied the island of Vieques for over 60 years. They forcibly displaced a huge percentage of the population, and they use most of the land for target practice, aerial bombardment. I believe even depleted uranium was used. They experimented here with Agent Orange before using it in Vietnam. Okay, it was sprayed in rivers. So no wonder there's a high incidence of cancer here. And in Vieques, it has a much higher rate of cancer. I forget the exact figure, but it's considered higher than the rest of the archipelago because all of the uranium munitions they use and all the pollution, 60 years of there. And there was a prolonged struggle to get the Marines out of for a while. For context, like I said, Puerto Rico, you have the main island, which people Puerto Rico Island, they think it's just the main island. But there are two smaller municipal islands, and they were occupied by the Marines for several decades. In the late 90s or early 2000s, a man was killed by a bomb dropped by the Marines in Vieques.
David.
He was a security guard, if I'm not mistaken. He was killed by the bomb, and I believe three other people were injured. A huge outcry and probably the biggest mass movement that we've ever seen in our history. More than 1 million people engaged in the struggle to keep the Marines out of Vieques. That was a huge victory that we mustn't forget because It's a reminder of our ability to fight back. We can fight for our sovereignty and have success. It's very important to learn from those experiences. So now with the whole Venezuela thing, this is part of a wider geostrategic position by the US. They know they're losing markets. They know they can't compete with the industrial economy of China. China has the opposite of neoliberalism. The essence of neoliberalism is the privatization of the natural monopolies, which usually are essential services like energy, power, transport infrastructure, highways, trains, internet is a natural monopoly, land is a natural monopoly, banks are a natural monopoly. All of that is nationalized in China. So they don't have the rent extraction, which brings so much inefficiency to the economy. So the US can't compete with the economy of China anymore, and they're losing markets all over the world. That's why we're seeing this tariff war against China. They want to contain China. We have to keep that in mind because all of this is connected with what they're doing in Venezuela and all of the Americas now. They realize they're losing control of the other continents. Their influence in Africa is diminishing as well. Both Russia and China have a very different approach in Africa. They don't bomb, they don't invade, they come with commercial deals, which are mutually beneficial for both peoples. So in Europe, they're also losing a bit of influence, although Europe remains a neo colony of the United States. And that's even the opinion of a very important French intellectual, Emmanuel Todd. So their ability to extract super profits from the rest of the world is diminishing, and this is threatening the empire. So they are strengthening their football in the Americas, what they call their backyard. They want to make sure they can keep their backyard because China mainly is also making strides in Latin America, to the point that an economics professor here, Marcia Rivera, I went to a conference that she gave, and she mentioned 4 points that are positive and that gives us hope for Latin America. One of them was the relationship of Latin America with China. Places like Uruguay, for instance, you're receiving Chinese investment. They're buying solar panels and wind turbines for the transition to renewables. Uruguay has almost 100% renewable energy now. In part, it's thanks to cooperation with China. They've invested in robotics, and now they have their own robotics industry. Marcela Rivera told me that now why children in fifth grade nationwide carry out a science project on robotics. We're way behind in that regard because we don't have any sovereignty. We don't have access to cheaper Chinese goods. We can import Chinese electric cars, for instance, because of the Trump tariffs. And it's a bipartisan, I shouldn't say just Trump tariffs. Biden increased the 25% tariff on electric vehicles to 100%. So it's a bipartisan effort to defend the interests of capital in the US. They're going back to protectionism. They espouse free trade when it's convenient for them and when they can produce more cheaply and conquer foreign markets. But when other people can produce more cheaply than them and they lose market influence, then they adopt protectionist measures. The US was founded under protectionist policies going back to Alexander Hamilton. If you go to the page of the US historian, you can read articles on how Hamilton promoted protectionism until native industries mature enough to compete in the international markets, in the international economy. So all of this is connected. Venezuela, 90% of their oil was going to China. China is a net importer of oil, and since the factory of the world, so to speak, they consume huge amounts of energy, and we all around the world consume their products. They have a really good relationship with Venezuela, and the United States wants that oil, among other things. They don't want the Venezuelan oil to go to China to feed its industry. But it's also important to remember that it's not only oil that the US is after. The empire never institutes policies just with one goal. It's usually multiple goals. In Venezuela, you have oil, earth minerals, lithium, you have other minerals, you have gold, diamonds, a lot of stuff and raw materials. Also, there's a big importance. Venezuela also supplies oil to Cuba. So if you can crush the Venezuelan economy and install a puppet government there, you can starve Cuba of oil and then proceed to create chaos, destabilize the government, and eventually overthrow it. All of this is part of a strategy of the US to strengthen their foothold in the whole of the Americas. And Puerto Rico has historically been used as a launch pad for invasions. US officials have referred to Israel as the US aircraft carrier in what they termed the Middle East, which is a colonial term. It's West Asia. But, they say, yeah, that's our aircraft carrier in the so-called Middle East. We're in a similar position. We are the aircraft carrier of the empire in the Caribbean, which is why the struggles of the Palestinian people and the Puerto Rican people mirror each other. We are both occupied, we've both been colonized, we've both been turned into an aircraft carrier for empire, where they can launch invasions and strikes against our brothers and our neighbors in the area, which are a lot with the Venezuelan people. The Arawak and Taínos that migrated to the Caribbean, to Puerto Rico, mainly came from Venezuela. So we quite a lot with the Venezuelan people and an ancestry. If you take a look at the map of the Caribbean and Latin America, Puerto Rico is much closer to Venezuela than the United States. And that's something a lot of people here don't realize. We're so close to Venezuela. And Puerto Rico has a key strategic position. It's been called the key of the Caribbean, of the Americas, because from here you can launch invasions everywhere. Simon Bolivar was planning to launch an invasion of Spain from Puerto Rico to overthrow the monarchy in Spain, liberate the Spanish people. Obviously, those plans never came to completion. But it speaks to the strategic location that Puerto Rico has, because not only can you launch invasions into the Americas from here, but also into Europe. So that's why the archipelago is so important for the empire, because of its geostrategic location. The invasion of Dominican Republic in the 20th century was launched from here, that of Panama as well, and some other interventions. And now we're seeing the same thing with Venezuela. That's why they are increasing militarization. We have like 15,000 troops stationed here now. They are carrying a military exercise, like you mentioned, practicing the operations that they eventually launched in Venezuela. And they've been doing that for almost a century now. So that's why they're not gonna let go so easily of the archipelago. Also, why it's so important, why Puerto Rican independence is so important. So I think many people here don't even realize just how important we are, and what a huge key to the puzzle we are. Because if Puerto Rico becomes an independent country, the ability of the empire to control the hemisphere will be greatly diminished. They will also receive less super profits from exploitation of the archipelago, and this combines to reduce their ability to project power. So if we become independent, that would be a huge step for the liberation of the entire hemisphere and the world, honestly, because I'll finish with this. Wrote in a letter to a socialist that he thought for Great Britain to become a socialist country, to have its socialist revolution, the colonies would need to get their independence first. And it makes sense, because when you have colonies, you're able to super profits, which you can invest for conquest, for empire. If you lose your colonies, the super profits are gone, and the ability to power is gone. Also, the ability to give your aristocracy a piece of to keep them content so that they don't rebel. So empires need to lose their colonies for socialist revolution to take hold. And one important component here is the de-dollarization phenomenon. The US mainly financed their military super profits in the earlier 20th century until they into troubles. I don't remember if it was after the Korean War and the start of the Vietnam War. When the dollar was linked to gold, you had the gold standard, and the US was losing gold reserves to finance the war. So they came up with fiat money. They turned the dollar into the global reserve currency after previously the pound sterling held that title. So that means that international transactions between states are carried out. The reserve currency of states around the world is the dollar. In international markets, you buy using the dollar. That's changing now quickly, with Russia and China doing commerce now almost exclusively in their own coins. And this is important because the US empire pretty much borrows money to keep its military. They recycle the dollars back to the States. So they have to run a trade deficit so that the rest of the world has access to dollars. When you run a trade deficit, you give out currency to buy imports. So they import more from some countries than they export to those countries, and they have to give them dollars. That way, the rest of the world has dollars to buy in the international market. And so what the rest of the world does with those dollars is that they buy treasury bonds, because you can keep your reserves in cash due to inflation. The value will be wiped away. So you buy treasury bonds because it's the so-called safest investment, and you are able to hedge inflation that way. So when you buy the treasury bonds, the dollars that the US lost through the trade deficit They are recycled back to the States. They come back to the United States. And that way they're able to use funds to finance their huge military budget that Trump wants to raise next year. So if they lose the global reserve currency status, they're pretty much screwed. They can't keep financing this overbloated military budget.
Okay, take a breath. I can't remember the question I had, so I'm trying to recall it, but we're going to close up anyways. I think it was something around the current state of affairs in the US and what our diaspora are experiencing, and how our struggle here ties to the struggle of the diaspora, and especially right now in this moment that we're in historically.
Sorry, I went on for too long.
No, it's good. We all do here. It's good to learn from you. I've been distracted by the jets.
I bet.
Yeah.
So
So sorry you're going through that right now.
before we close on, do you feel like in your generation, you feel that the youth are becoming more? Because I'm seeing that you have a Palestinian flag in the back, and you mentioned the ties between Puerto Rico and Israel as colonial projects in the context of the genocide against Palestinians. I know that you've been active in that area in Puerto Rico as well, protesting and stuff like that. Do you feel that your generation is more in tune with internationalism, have more consciousness towards internationalism than before because of the situation that you're in right now?
Yes, I do. Before I go on, I'd like to make a couple of comments about what Monisha was talking about the diaspora in the United States. We have to keep in mind that there are twice as many Puerto Ricans in the United States nowadays than there are in the archipelago. Quite literally, we have like 3 million people left in Puerto Rico. That number is diminishing. And there are around 6 million or more Puerto Ricans in the US. All in all, we're around 9 to 10 million Puerto Ricans around the world. How many countries do you know that have twice as many people living abroad than in the homeland? That's nuts. So that's why it's so important to have a link to the diaspora for the struggle for independence here. A lot of people in the diaspora didn't want to leave. They were forced to deteriorate material conditions here. They're just trying to survive and make a living. There's always been a connection between the diaspora and the Puerto Ricans here. Some people have a narrow view about it and they don't consider Puerto Ricans in the diaspora actual Puerto Ricans, especially if they don't speak Spanish. That's a notion we need to overcome because we need all the help we can get from an internationalist perspective. And I think historically there's been some consciousness about it. For instance, the Socialist Party here, they had a branch in New York as well as in Cuba. They understood the importance of working with the diaspora there. It's an internationalist class struggle. So the international working class must work together, not just with the diaspora, but with other socialist states that are resisting imperialism and even non-socialist states that are resisting imperialism. Because the primary contradiction in the world is US imperialism against the international working class. So we need to bear that in mind. We need to make ideological alliances as well as alliances with countries that may not necessarily be socialist, but who play a progressive role in the international arena. I think there's a growing consciousness about the need for internationalism here. It speaks about how the development of the productive forces brings about technological changes that allow the working class to organize better. So you had the printing press, and now you can transmit information that way. Since Marxist time, you've had the development of radio, of television. More importantly, for the contemporary context, internet. Everybody nowadays have, I don't want to say everybody, but many people, if not most people, have access to internet. They can see the images of what's happening in Palestine. We are all witnessing a genocide unfold live from our phones. It's hard not to get exposed to it. And with the censorship, people are still being exposed to these horrific images. And like you mentioned, it's not just Palestine, but also Congo and Sudan are going a genocide right now. So we have 3 genocides running parallel to each other right now. How messed up is that? And we're seeing the images of these. We're seeing the images coming out of the operation in Venezuela to kidnap President Maduro. So I think there's a growing consciousness of how perverse the empire is and how violent the nature of empire is. So I think that is bringing about a more internationalist perspective. I'm seeing the change even we have a huge problem with branches of Marxism that don't support actually existing socialism or even much less non-socialist states that resist empire. That's why Michael Parenti is so important. People like him teach the importance of internationalism and resisting empire. We can't resist empire by ourselves. We need to have an internationalist perspective. If you study the history of revolutions in China, in North Korea, and Vietnam, they all receive material aid from other socialist states. In China, they receive material aid from the Soviet Union. And you have a branch of Marxism that opposes this, namely Trotskyism. I would refer you to Ho Chi Minh's letters on the activity of Trotskyites in China. He wrote 3 letters to the Soviet Union around 1939, reporting of the activities of the Trotskyites. So they opposed the Soviet Union because they oppose Stalin or whatever. Actually, Trotskyism is its opposition to Leninism from 1903 to 1917. Trotsky opposed Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and he was with the Mensheviks. I spoke earlier about how Lenin understood that the peasant was a potentially revolutionary class. Trotsky had the complete opposite perspective. He thought the peasants were a reactionary class. And his theory of permanent revolution hinges upon this position. So there was a lot of rivalry between them, and you can read Lenin's writing during this time calling Trotsky a swine, saying things like, what a swine this Trotsky is, and stuff like that. Trotsky has developed this resistance to Marxism-Leninism, which in turn developed into a opposition to actually existing socialism, because actually existing socialism is Marxist-Leninist. So in China, they didn't want aid from the Soviet Union, and the communist movement would have never been able to reach victory without aid from the Soviet Union. Same thing in Vietnam. That's why Ho Chi Minh also opposed Trotskyism, and he understood that Vietnam would need aid from both China and the Soviet Union primarily to overcome French colonialism, Japanese occupation, and eventually the U.S. empire. Without that internationalism, that material aid and the diplomatic aid, they would have never become independent, much less a socialist country. So I think we need to overcome those barriers to internationalism like anarchism, because we're never going to have a successful revolution here without an internationalist perspective. Internationalism means bringing critical support to the states resisting imperialism. Can be just an abstraction of, I support the working class there, but I don't support the state. I oppose the state in Venezuela, but I also oppose U.S. empire. You have to understand the stages of revolution and the limitations that these countries have. You can't support an imaginary revolutionary communist movement in countries where it doesn't exist, where the only option is the current government or a US-backed puppet government that is going to be much worse for the people. So that, I think it's very, very important to develop that internationalist view. And I see people who have been previously closed off to the notion of supporting actually existing socialism. There's starting to be a change in mindset, which I think is extremely positive. So yeah, let's do our best to promote the work of Michael Parenti. His work survives him, and it's still teaching people a lot. So let's support people like him and others.
What do we think? That was a really nice closure right there. Is there anything else you want to add, Jovanni?
I think it's a good place to wrap up. Alexis, he wrapped it up brilliantly. Alexis, any last comments before we take off?
I'd like to close with why I included my favorite quote by Marx in the bio that you asked me to send to you. Ignorance has yet to help anybody. It is the duty of young people to defend the homeland with the weapons of knowledge. And lastly, we must look for the truth in the facts. So all three of these pretty much say the same thing: study. We have to learn, and learn the best weapon that we have against empire. Like the Argentinian Marxist scholar Nestor Cohen says, the working class is the inheritors of a philosophy. It made us the inheritors of philosophy. The working class is the one that produces intellectuals. Big capitalists, they don't have any incentive to study. They don't have to study to get ahead. They are already ahead at the time of birth because, they're going to inherit. So we are the ones that need to study to get ahead. And that's our best weapon. Education is the best weapon that the working class has. So we must study Marxism in order to use the method of dialectical and historical materialism to have a better understanding and grasp of our social reality in order to be able to change it. Thank you so much for inviting me over. It's been a very stimulating conversation. I didn't get a chance to ask you guys about how you joined the military, but perhaps we can discuss that another time.
Part two, and this time you need both of us.
I'm very interested in hearing your stories, and I think people need to hear your stories as well so that they can understand how the material condition here forces people to join the armed forces, even if they don't really believe in them, because you need to survive that way. And I have many friends who've been forced to go down that route.
Yeah, I do think people need to understand that the military is a working class issue. Military
Yes.
recruitment is a working class issue. So many people that I've encountered in my experience, and they're not wrong for how they feel. It exists to kill and destroy and nothing else. And there are people in the military who align with that. Their values are to kill and destroy for their own advancement, their own personal profit, and they're trash human beings. Yes, hate on them. But the rest of us are just, I consider myself having been economically drafted. The recruiters that came to my high school was in a very impoverished area of the US, and it was all black and brown kids. Promised us education, promised us money, promised us a better life than what we had, and that's how recruitment works. So it is a working class issue, and I wish people would embrace that in their learning. Like when you talk about studying, yes, I also hope that people study beyond the theorists because that's a foundational study. And then there's everything else that we need to be able to augment our understandings based on those foundational studies, including patriarchy, including white supremacy, including all of these systems of oppression that exist to uphold capitalism and the empire. A singular analysis that's going to give us the lens we need to be able to understand all of these things in a way to develop coherent strategies, tactics, etc., to get us to the goal of dismantling this crap. We have to understand how all of it works together in order to build ourselves up with, I'm not trying to say like a proper approach, but you know what I mean. We're not going to get our goal unless we know what the lay of the land is and we know who all the players are and we know our own selves, our own participation in these systems. We have to change our behavior within these systems as well. Going back to that, like as a veteran, there was a time where I was drinking the Kool-Aid. Not all of us that go in are gung ho, but not all of us are completely developed ideological beings either. So there's just a lot to it. I'm not trying to go off and take up more time.
I'm in complete agreement with you. I think it's very important what you're bringing up. Giovanni, please go on.
What happened?
Please go on. If there's anything you'd like to say to close.
Yeah, whatever work you're doing, share with us whatever work you're doing, wherever people can find you. What actions do you think people should consider to go forward? Yeah.
I think our main task should be to construct a working class party that is a mass-based party, a revolutionary party, Marxist-Leninist, a vanguard party, because that's what's been proven to work. And we need to understand that we Marxists need to cooperate with nationalists because nationalism in Puerto Rico is a progressive ideology. And there's a mass of nationalist people that we need to work in club with. So yeah, I think that's our task to build the revolutionary working class party that we don't have because that's the instrument how we fight for ourselves on the working class because we are there. So yeah, I think we need to work towards that goal.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that you just made there about nationalism in Puerto Rico. Here in the context of the United States, nationalism is something, particularly from the liberals' perspective and American leftist perspective, nationalism is something poo-pooed on. It has a negative connotation and ideas of Nazis and fascists comes up into people's mind. But nationalism in the context of the global South is liberation on the context of the global South. And Cuba wouldn't been able to sustain 60 plus years of economic warfare against it if it wasn't from nationalism, because nationalism is the glue in the global South context that keep people together and keep people able to resist and fight back. We've seen it in real time in Venezuela where the leadership was kidnapped and taken in the middle of the night, yet the country hasn't broken down into chaos and Chavismo continues to function, move forward because of nationalism. because it wasn't about just one person. It's about a whole movement in Venezuela. So yeah, so that's a pretty great point that you just made there about nationalism in Puerto Rico.
Just one last thing to close. The hammer and sickle symbol represents the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. We need to have an alliance between Marx and Albizu Campos here. We need to make that synthesis here as well.
All right, Nisha, anything?
Nope. Thank you.
All right, folks, thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our conversation here. Hope that you left here knowing a little bit more about Puerto Rico and the different dynamics that's occurring in Puerto Rico, political dynamics and socially and economically. I hope to see you guys soon. Please share us with your friends, like us on social media. Yeah, and take care, everyone.
Money is tight these days for everyone. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that. In addition, any support we receive makes sure we can continue to provide our main episodes free for everyone. And for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Ren Jacob, and Helgeberg. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.